The dusty streets of Copper Ridge had seen their share of strangers, but none quite like the woman who stepped off the afternoon stagecoach on that sweltering July day in 1882. Clara Whitmore emerged from the weathered vehicle like a crimson flame against the sun-bleached backdrop of the frontier town, her red dress immaculate despite the long journey from Denver. The fabric of her gown whispered against the wooden steps as she descended, one gloved hand gathering her skirts, the other clutching a worn leather satchel. Her dark hair was pinned in an elegant chignon beneath a small hat adorned with black feathers, and her green eyes surveyed the town with a mixture of determination and something deeper, something that looked almost like recognition. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Jake Henley from his perch outside the general store, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Another one of them fancy ladies come to try her luck." The whispers started immediately, spreading through the small crowd that had gathered to watch the stagecoach arrival. It was the kind of entertainment that broke the monotony of frontier life, where the arrival of mail or a new face could provide weeks of conversation material. "Look at that dress," said Mrs. Catherine Brennan, the banker's wife, adjusting her own modest brown skirt with obvious disapproval. "No decent woman travels alone dressed like that." Probably heading to work at Murphy's saloon," added Sarah Mitchell, the seamstress, her voice carrying the particular brand of righteousness that small-town women wielded like weapons. "Or maybe she's heard about the Whitmore Ranch situation and thinks she can charm her way into some money." Clara heard every word. She had learned long ago that appearing not to listen was often the best way to gather information. The mention of the Whitmore Ranch made her pause, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. These people had no idea who she was, and that suited her perfectly for now. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Pete who had been running this route for 15 years, unloaded her trunk with unnecessary force. "This here's all your belongings, miss." "That's correct," Clara replied, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent that immediately marked her as an outsider. "Could you direct me to the hotel?" Pete gestured down the main street with a jerk of his thumb. "Copper Ridge Inn, about 3 blocks down. Can't miss it. Only 2-story building in town, except for the church." As Clara lifted her satchel and prepared to make the walk, a young man in his 20s approached hesitantly. He had kind eyes and the calloused hands of someone who worked with horses. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Tom Fletcher. I work at the livery stable. If you need someone to carry your trunk to the hotel, I'd be happy to help." Clara studied him for a moment, noting the genuine politeness in his manner, a stark contrast to the suspicious stares from the other townspeople. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Fletcher. I would appreciate that." As Tom hoisted her trunk onto his shoulder with practiced ease, Clara began walking down the dusty main street. The town of Copper Ridge was typical of many frontier settlements, a single main thoroughfare lined with wooden buildings that had been thrown up quickly and pragmatically. The general store, blacksmith shop, saloon and sheriff's office formed the commercial heart of the community, while modest houses and a white-painted church marked the residential areas. "You visiting someone in particular?" Tom asked as they walked, his tone conversational rather than prying. "In a manner of speaking," Clara replied carefully. "I have some business to attend to regarding property in the area." This caused Tom to glance at her with renewed interest. "Property? Don't get many folks looking to buy land around here anymore. Most of the good ranches are already taken, and the mining claims dried up years ago." They passed Murphy's saloon, where several men lounged on the front porch despite the early hour. Clara felt their eyes tracking her movement, heard the low murmur of comments she couldn't quite make out. One man, distinguished-looking with silver hair and an expensive suit that marked him as someone of importance in the community, watched her with particular intensity. "That's Judge Morrison," Tom said quietly, noticing her glance. "Runs most of the legal business in town. Good man to know if you're dealing with property matters." Clara filed this information away without comment. The Copper Ridge Inn was indeed impossible to miss, a substantial 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and freshly painted sign. The proprietor, a middle-aged woman with greying hair and a practical manner, emerged as they approached. "Mrs. Edna Hastings," she introduced herself, wiping her hands on her apron. "You'll be wanting a room." "Yes, please, for an indefinite period." Mrs. Hastings raised an eyebrow at this, but simply nodded. "That'll be $2 a week, meals included. You traveling alone?" "I am." The question hung in the air with all its implications in a society where unaccompanied women were viewed with suspicion. Clara met Mrs. Hastings's gaze steadily, neither defensive nor apologetic. "Room 3 is available," Mrs. Hastings said finally. "Top of the stairs faces the street. You'll have a good view of the comings and goings." As Tom carried her trunk upstairs, Clara noticed the hotel's interior was clean and well-maintained, with sturdy furniture and lace curtains that spoke of Mrs. Hastings' efforts to bring civilization to the frontier. The room was small but adequate, with a bed, washstand, and a single chair positioned near the window. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Fletcher," Clara said, offering him a coin for his service. Tom accepted it gratefully. "If you need anything else, ma'am, just ask around for me. Everybody knows where to find the livery stable." After he left, Clara moved to the window and looked out at the main street. From this vantage point, she could see most of the town's activity. People moved about their daily business, but she noticed how many glances were directed toward the hotel. Word of her arrival was already spreading. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe and placing her personal items on the washstand. From the bottom of her trunk, she carefully extracted a wooden box worn smooth by countless handlings. Inside, wrapped in silk, were documents that would change everything for this town, if she could survive long enough to present them. That evening, Clara made her first appearance in the hotel's dining room. The other guests, a traveling merchant and an elderly couple passing through, regarded her with polite curiosity, but she could feel the weight of attention from the townspeople who had found reasons to linger near the inn. Mrs. Hastings served a hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread, and Clara ate slowly, listening to the conversations around her. The talk was of typical frontier concerns: weather, cattle prices, and the ongoing dispute over water rights between the ranchers and the newer settlers. "Shame about the Whitmore place," she heard the traveling merchant say to his dinner companion. "Beautiful piece of land, but it'll probably go for nothing at the auction next week." Clara's fork paused halfway to her mouth, but she gave no other sign that the conversation interested her. "Well," replied the elderly man, "I heard tell there's some question about the ownership. Something about the widow not being found after Thomas Whitmore died." "Widow?" the merchant scoffed. "More likely some opportunist who thought she could inherit what wasn't rightfully hers. Judge Morrison wouldn't have called for an auction if there was a legitimate claim." After dinner, Clara retired to her room and sat by the window as the sun set over Copper Ridge. The main street slowly emptied as people returned to their homes, but she remained vigilant. She had learned that information was currency in small towns, and she intended to be rich in it before she made her next move. As the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Clara opened the wooden box again and carefully examined the documents inside. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate process of reclaiming what was rightfully hers. But tonight, she was content to let them think she was just another gold digger who had wandered into their midst. They had no idea that the real owner had already arrived. Clara woke before dawn, a habit formed during her difficult journey to Copper Ridge. The early morning hours in frontier towns offered the best opportunity to observe without being observed, and she had learned to value every advantage. She dressed carefully in a modest blue dress, less conspicuous than the red one that had caused such a stir the day before, and made her way quietly downstairs. Mrs. Hastings was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for her guests. The woman looked up with mild surprise at Clara's early appearance. "You're an early riser," she observed, kneading dough for the morning biscuits. "Coffee's ready if you'd like some." "Thank you," Clara said, accepting the offered cup gratefully. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way frontier people preferred it. I thought I might take a walk around town this morning, get familiar with the area. Mrs. Hastings gave her a shrewd look. Most folks who come through here are either passing through to somewhere else or looking to settle down. You strike me as neither. Clara sipped her coffee, considering her response carefully. Eleanor Hastings seemed like a woman who had survived on the frontier by being observant and practical, qualities that Clara respected. "I suppose you could say I'm looking to reclaim something that belongs to me," she said finally. "Reclaim?" Mrs. Hastings's eyebrows rose. "That's an interesting word choice. Most people say they're looking to buy or find something." Before Clara could respond, the front door of the inn opened with a bang that echoed through the quiet building. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden floor, and a man's voice called out, "Eleanor, you in there?" Mrs. Hastings sighed. "That's Sheriff Reynolds. Must be important for him to come calling this early." She wiped her hands on her apron and headed toward the front room, with Clara following at a discreet distance. Sheriff Reynolds was a big man, broad-shouldered and weathered by years of frontier life. His badge caught the early morning light streaming through the windows, and his expression was serious as he spoke to Mrs. Hastings. "Need to ask if you've got any new guests, Eleanor. Specifically, a woman traveling alone." "I might," Mrs. Hastings replied carefully. "Depends on why you're asking." Clara stepped into view, decision made. "Are you looking for me, Sheriff?" Reynolds turned to study her, his pale blue eyes taking in everything from her modest dress to the way she held herself. Confident, but not challenging. "Depends. You the lady who arrived on yesterday's stage?" "I am, Clara Whitmore." The name hung in the air like a gunshot. Sheriff Reynolds's expression shifted from professional interest to something much more complex, while Mrs. Hastings drew in a sharp breath. "Whitmore," Reynolds repeated slowly. "As in Thomas Whitmore?" "As in Thomas Whitmore's widow," Clara confirmed, meeting his gaze steadily. The sheriff removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "Ma'am, I think we need to have a conversation." "Official-like." "Of course," Clara agreed, "though I should mention that I have documentation to support my identity and my claims." This caused Reynolds to pause. Whatever he had been expecting, it wasn't a widow who arrived prepared with legal documents. "Mrs. Hastings," he said finally, "might we use your parlor for a few minutes? This is a matter that concerns the whole town." Eleanor nodded, leading them to a small sitting room, furnished with horsehair chairs and a settee. Clara took a seat and arranged her skirts carefully, maintaining the composed demeanor that had served her well in more dangerous situations than this. Sheriff Reynolds settled into a chair that creaked under his weight. "Mrs. Whitmore, if that's who you are, there are some folks in town who are going to be very interested in your arrival." "I'm sure there are," Clara replied, "particularly those who have been assuming that Thomas's property would be available for acquisition at a significant discount." The directness of her statement seemed to catch Reynolds off guard. He had clearly expected either a weeping widow or a scheming opportunist, not a woman who spoke about legal matters with such precision. "The judge declared Thomas dead after he'd been missing for over a year," Reynolds explained, "and there was no sign of a wife, no marriage certificate on file here in town. Judge Morrison figured he died intestate, with no heirs." Clara reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded document. "This is a certified copy of our marriage certificate, filed in Denver in 1879. I also have Thomas's will, properly witnessed and notarized, leaving everything to me." Reynolds accepted the documents with obvious reluctance, examining them carefully. His frown deepened as he read. "These look legitimate," he admitted. "But why are you just now coming forward? Thomas has been dead for over a year." Clara had anticipated this question and had her answer prepared. "I've been in San Francisco, caring for my dying father. I only learned of Thomas's death 3 months ago, when I finally returned to Denver and found the letter he had left with his attorney. It was a plausible story, and mostly true." What she didn't mention was the other letter she had found, the one that had warned her that Thomas's death might not have been the accident everyone believed it to be. "There's something else you should know, Sheriff," Clara continued. "Thomas didn't die interstate. He left detailed instructions about the management of his property and specific bequests to several people in town. I have that will with me as well." This information clearly troubled Reynolds. If Clara was telling the truth, then the upcoming auction of the Whitmore Ranch was not only illegal, but would dispossess the rightful owner of valuable property. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see those documents and have them verified, and I'm going to need to inform Judge Morrison about your arrival immediately." "Of course," Clara agreed. "I would expect nothing less." After Sheriff Reynolds left, Mrs. Hastings poured herself a cup of coffee and studied Clara with new interest. "Thomas Whitmore was a good man," she said finally. "Kept to himself mostly, but always paid his bills and treated folks fairly. He built that ranch up from nothing." "Yes, he did," Clara agreed softly. "He was very proud of what he had accomplished." "How long were you married?" 3 years. We met in Denver when he came to town on business." Clara's voice carried a note of genuine sadness. "He wanted me to come to Copper Ridge with him, but my father was ill and I couldn't leave him. That must have been hard, being separated." "It was." Clara met Mrs. Hastings' sympathetic gaze. "Thomas wrote to me every week, telling me about the ranch, about the town, about his plans for the future. He was going to send for me as soon as my father's condition stabilized. But he died before that could happen." "Yes." Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. "A riding accident, according to the letter from the sheriff. His horse allegedly spooked and threw him into the rocks near Devil's Canyon." Mrs. Hastings nodded sadly. "Found him 3 days later. Terrible thing. That horse of his came back to the ranch riderless. And that's when folks knew something was wrong." Clara filed this detail away. In his letters, Thomas had often mentioned his horse, a reliable gelding named Ranger that he had trained himself. It seemed unlikely that such a steady animal would spook without cause. "Mrs. Hastings," Clara said carefully, "what can you tell me about the people who have been managing Thomas's property since his death?" The older woman's expression grew guarded. "The court appointed a temporary administrator, man named Garrett Blackwood. He's been keeping the cattle operation running, supposedly preserving the value until the auction." "Blackwood," Clara repeated. The name was familiar from Thomas's letters, but not in a positive context. Thomas mentioned him. He said Blackwood had approached him several times about selling the ranch. "That's right. Garrett owns the spread just south of Thomas's place. Always claimed he needed the water rights that came with the Whitmore land." Clara absorbed this information, feeling pieces of a puzzle begin to arrange themselves in her mind. "And Judge Morrison? What's his involvement in all this?" Mrs. Hastings hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Judge Morrison is, well, he's been handling the legal aspects of Thomas's estate. He's the one who declared Thomas dead and arranged for the auction." "I see." Clara's tone was neutral, but her mind was racing. In frontier towns, the lines between legal authority and personal interest were often blurred. If Judge Morrison stood to benefit from the auction of Thomas's property, his declaration of death might have been motivated by more than just legal procedure. "Mrs. Hastings, I hope you'll forgive the directness of my question, but is Judge Morrison an honest man?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with implications that both women understood perfectly. Mrs. Hastings looked toward the window, as if checking to see who might be within earshot. "Judge Morrison has been the law in this town for 15 years, she said finally. "He's thorough in his methods." It was a carefully diplomatic answer that told Clara everything she needed to know. Judge Morrison was a man who wielded his authority for personal gain, and Thomas's estate had presented him with an opportunity that he wasn't about to let slip away, especially not for the inconvenient arrival of a legitimate widow. Clara spent the rest of the morning walking through Copper Ridge, ostensibly exploring the town, but actually gathering intelligence. She visited the general store, where the proprietor, a talkative man named Samuel Brooks, was eager to discuss the upcoming auction. "Finest piece of grazing land in the territory," he told her enthusiastically. "Whoever gets it is going to make a fortune in the cattle business. Course, it should go for a fair price, what with the competition and all." "Competition?" Clara inquired innocently. "Oh yes, several folks are interested. Garrett Blackwood's been the front runner, seeing as how he's been managing the place. But I heard tell that some investors from back east might be sending representatives." Clara made appropriate murmurs of interest, while mentally noting that Blackwood's position as temporary administrator gave him significant advantages in any auction. He would have intimate knowledge of the property's value and condition, information that other bidders would lack. Her next stop was the bank, where she encountered Catherine Brennan, the banker's wife who had been so vocal about Clara's appearance the day before. Mrs. Brennan was conducting some business at the counter and looked up with poorly concealed curiosity when Clara entered. "Good morning," Clara said pleasantly. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I believe we may have some mutual interest regarding property in the area." The effect of her introduction was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Brennan's face went pale, and she clutched her reticule as if Clara might snatch it from her hands. "Whitmore," she stammered, But that's impossible. Thomas Whitmore had no wife." "Actually, he did," Clara replied calmly. "I have the marriage certificate to prove it." News of Clara's identity spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. By afternoon, she could feel the weight of attention wherever she went. Conversations stopped when she approached, and she caught glimpses of people pointing and whispering. The atmosphere had shifted from mere curiosity about a stranger to something much more tense and uncertain. As evening approached, Clara returned to the inn for dinner, her mind churning with the information she had gathered. The situation was more complex than she had initially realized. Thomas's death, the swift declaration that he had died intestate, the appointment of Garrett Blackwood as administrator, and the hasty scheduling of an auction all suggested a coordinated effort to dispossess her of her inheritance. But Clara had survived worse odds than these. She had the law on her side, and more importantly, she had underestimated neither the intelligence nor the determination that had carried her this far. As she climbed the stairs to her room, she caught sight of several men gathered in the shadows across the street from the inn. They were watching the building with the focused attention of people who were planning something. Clara drew the curtains of her room and checked the lock on her door twice before settling down to examine her documents once more. Tomorrow, she would present herself to Judge Morrison and make her claim official. Tonight, she would prepare for whatever obstacles they might place in her path. The game was about to begin in earnest. The next morning brought with it a change in the weather that seemed to mirror the tension building in Copper Ridge. Grey clouds gathered on the horizon, and a cool wind swept down from the mountains, stirring the dust in the streets and setting loose shutters to banging against the buildings. Clara dressed with particular care, choosing her black traveling dress, a garment that spoke of respectability and mourning in equal measure. She had requested a meeting with Judge Morrison through Sheriff Reynolds, and the appointment had been set for 10 o'clock at the courthouse. As Clara walked down the main street, she was acutely aware of the eyes following her progress. Word of her identity had spread throughout the town, and the reactions were mixed, some curious, some hostile, and some simply fearful of the changes her presence might bring. The courthouse was a modest brick building that also housed the sheriff's office and the town's small jail. Judge Morrison's chambers were on the second floor, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked under Clara's feet. She paused outside the door marked Hon J. Morrison, Circuit Judge, and took a steadying breath before knocking. "Come in!" called a deep voice from within. Judge Morrison's office was furnished with the kind of heavy, dark furniture that was meant to convey authority and permanence. Law books lined the walls, and a large desk dominated the center of the room. Behind it sat Judge Morrison himself, the distinguished-looking man Clara had noticed watching her on her first day in town. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair combed carefully back and keen grey eyes that missed very little. His expensive suit and gold watch chain marked him as a man of means, unusual for a frontier judge whose salary would typically be modest. "Mrs. Whitmore, I presume?" he said, rising from his chair with practiced courtesy. "Please, have a seat." Clara settled herself in the chair facing his desk, noting how he had hesitated over her name. "Thank you for seeing me, Judge Morrison. I believe Sheriff Reynolds has informed you of the nature of my visit." "Indeed he has." Morrison resumed his seat and steepled his fingers. "You claim to be the widow of Thomas Whitmore, deceased." "I don't claim to be," Clara corrected gently. "I am Thomas Whitmore's widow." The judge's expression hardened slightly at her firm tone. "You must understand, that is to say, Miss, what am I to call you? Mrs. Whitmore will be perfectly appropriate. You must understand that your sudden appearance raises several questions. Thomas Whitmore lived in this community for nearly 5 years. He never mentioned a wife, never received visits from one, and left no documentation of a marriage when he died." Clara opened her reticule and withdrew the documents she had shown Sheriff Reynolds. "I believe you'll find this marriage certificate quite in order. It was filed with the proper authorities in Denver in June of 1879. Judge Morrison accepted the certificate and examined it through a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, his frown deepening as he read. Clara watched his face carefully, noting the way his jaw tightened when he reached the signatures and official seals. "This appears to be legitimate," he admitted reluctantly. "However, there remains the question of why you have only now come forward to claim your inheritance." Clara had rehearsed this explanation, but she delivered it with the kind of emotional authenticity that came from lived experience. "My father was gravely ill in San Francisco, Judge Morrison. He had consumption, and I was his only family. Thomas understood that I couldn't abandon my father in his final months, but he wanted me to join him in Copper Ridge as soon as possible." She paused, allowing a note of genuine sadness to enter her voice. "Thomas wrote to me every week. He told me about the ranch, about his plans for our future together. He was going to send for me in the spring of 1881, but—" She let the sentence trail off. "But he died before that could happen," Morrison finished. "Yes, I didn't learn of his death until 3 months ago, when I finally returned to Denver after my father's funeral. Thomas's attorney had been holding a letter for me, along with other important documents." Clara withdrew another paper from her reticule. "This is Thomas's will, Judge Morrison. As you'll see, it's properly witnessed and notarized. It leaves everything to me with specific provisions for certain bequests to people in town who had been kind to him." The judge's face went ashen as he read the will. Clara watched his reaction carefully, noting how his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. When he finished reading, he set the document down with excessive care, as if it might explode. "This is most irregular," he said finally. "The procedures for declaring Thomas dead and arranging for the disposition of his property were conducted according to territorial law. An auction has already been scheduled and advertised." I understand that mistakes were made," Clara replied diplomatically, "but surely the law provides remedies for situations where new evidence comes to light." Judge Morrison stood abruptly and walked to the window, gazing out at the main street below. His shoulders were tense, and Clara could practically see him calculating the implications of her arrival. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said without turning around, "you must understand that your late husband's property has been under careful management for over a year. Significant expenses have been incurred in maintaining the cattle operation and preserving the value of the estate. These costs would need to be recovered from the proceeds of any sale." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Are you suggesting that the ranch should still be sold, even though I am here to claim my rightful inheritance?" "I'm suggesting that the matter is more complicated than you might realize." Morrison turned back to face her, his expression now openly hostile. "There are debts, Mrs. Whitmore, substantial debts that your husband incurred in the months before his death. This was the first Clara had heard of any debts, and she was certain that Thomas would have mentioned such matters in his letters. What sort of debts, Judge Morrison? Gambling debts, primarily. Your husband had developed quite a fondness for cards in his final months. He owed money to several prominent citizens of this town. Clara kept her expression neutral, but inwardly she was seething. Thomas had been many things: impulsive, overly optimistic, sometimes reckless in business, but he had never been a gambler. His letters had often mentioned his disdain for the men who spent their evenings and wages at the poker tables in Murphy's saloon. "I find that difficult to believe," she said carefully. Thomas was very specific in his letters about his financial situation. He was proud of the fact that he owned his property free and clear. People can change, Mrs. Whitmore. Isolation and loneliness can drive men to behaviors they might not otherwise consider. The implication hung in the air between them that Thomas's decline into gambling had been caused by his wife's absence. Clara recognized the manipulation for what it was, but she also understood that challenging it directly would accomplish nothing. "I would like to see documentation of these alleged debts," she said instead. Judge Morrison's smile was thin and unpleasant. "Of course. I'll have the relevant papers prepared for your review. In the meantime, I suggest you consider the possibility that the most practical solution might be to proceed with the auction as planned. The proceeds could be used to settle the debts, and any remainder would naturally come to you as Thomas's heir." Clara stood, recognizing that the meeting had served its purpose. She now understood exactly what she was facing: a coordinated effort to steal her inheritance, with Judge Morrison at the center of it. The alleged gambling debts were almost certainly fabricated, designed to provide legal justification for dispossessing her of the ranch. "Thank you for your time, Judge Morrison," she said with icy politeness. "I'll be very interested to review those debt documents. I'm sure my attorney will find them fascinating as well." The mention of an attorney caused Morrison's eyes to narrow. "You've retained legal counsel?" "I have interests to protect," Clara replied ambiguously. She hadn't actually hired an attorney yet, but Morrison didn't need to know that. As Clara descended the courthouse stairs, she felt the weight of the challenge she faced. Judge Morrison clearly had no intention of simply accepting her claim and cancelling the auction. He and his associates had invested too much in their scheme to abandon it now. They would fight her with every legal and illegal means at their disposal. But Clara had advantages they didn't know about. Thomas's letters had contained more than expressions of love and descriptions of ranch life. He had also shared his growing suspicions about certain people in town, his concerns about pressure to sell his land, and his growing belief that some of his neighbors were not what they seemed. More importantly, Thomas had been a careful man who kept detailed records. If those records still existed somewhere on the ranch, they would provide evidence of his true financial situation and possibly expose the lies that Morrison and his associates were building their case upon. Clara walked slowly back toward the inn, her mind already working on her next moves. She needed to get onto the Whitmore ranch and search for Thomas's papers. She needed to find allies in town, people who had known and respected Thomas and might be willing to help her fight the corruption that was trying to steal her inheritance. And most urgently, she needed to find out exactly what had happened to Thomas on the day he died. Because the more she learned about the people trying to dispossess her, the more convinced she became that Thomas's death had been no accident. As she passed Murphy's saloon, she noticed several men gathered on the front porch, their conversation stopping abruptly when they saw her. One of them was a tall, lean man with cold blue eyes and prematurely grey hair. He watched her with the calculating expression of a predator sizing up potential prey. Clara met his gaze steadily for a moment before continuing on her way. She had seen that look before, in Denver and San Francisco and a dozen other places where men thought they could intimidate a woman traveling alone. This man, who she suspected was Garrett Blackwood, would learn, as others had, that Clara Whitmore was not easily intimidated. The afternoon brought unexpected rain, a sudden downpour that sent people scurrying for shelter and turned the dusty streets into muddy rivers. Clara sat by her window, watching the storm and planning her strategy. Tomorrow, she would begin the real fight for her inheritance. Tonight, she would prepare for war. The storm that had blown through Copper Ridge the previous afternoon had left the air clean and sharp, with puddles reflecting the morning sky like scattered mirrors. Clara woke with a sense of determination that had been building since her confrontation with Judge Morrison. Today, she would begin to unravel the web of deception that had been spun around her husband's death and her inheritance. Her first destination was the ranch itself. She had deliberately waited several days before attempting to visit the property, wanting to establish her presence in town and gauge the opposition before making any direct moves. Now, with her legal claim documented and her adversaries identified, it was time to see what remained of the life Thomas had built. Clara arranged to rent a horse and buggy from Tom Fletcher at the livery stable. The young man seemed pleased to see her again, and his friendly manner provided a welcome contrast to the hostile suspicion she had encountered from most of the town's residents. "The Whitmore place is about an hour's ride north of town," Tom explained, as he hitched a gentle mare to the buggy. "Good road most of the way, though you'll want to watch for washouts after yesterday's rain." "You knew my husband well?" Clara asked, as she settled herself on the buggy seat. Tom nodded, his expression growing serious. "Mr. Whitmore was a good man. Always treated me fair, paid his bills on time. He used to come into town every couple of weeks for supplies and always had a kind word for everyone. What did you think of his accident?" The question caused Tom to pause in his task of adjusting the harness. He glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard before speaking in a lower voice. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've been around horses my whole life. Ranger, that was Mr. Thomas's gelding, was about the steadiest animal you could find. It didn't make sense to me that he would spook and throw an experienced rider like your husband." Clara felt a surge of vindication. "Did you share these thoughts with anyone at the time?" "Tried to. Mentioned it to Sheriff Reynolds, but he said accidents happen and there was no point in questioning God's will." Tom's expression suggested he hadn't been satisfied with that explanation. "Course, I'm just a stable hand. Nobody pays much attention to what I think about such matters." As Clara drove out of town, she reflected on Tom's observations. His doubt about the circumstances of Thomas's death aligned with her own growing suspicions, and it suggested that others in town might have questions they had been afraid or discouraged from asking. The road to the Whitmore Ranch led through some of the most beautiful country Clara had ever seen. Rolling hills covered with tall grass stretched toward the mountains, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance, some of them likely belonging to her inheritance. Thomas's letters had described this landscape in loving detail, but seeing it herself made Clara understand why he had been so determined to build a life here. The ranch house came into view as she crested a small hill, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was exactly as Thomas had described it in his letters, a substantial two-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide front porch and large windows that would catch the morning sun. Outbuildings dotted the surrounding area, a barn, corrals, a bunkhouse, and various sheds that spoke of a thriving operation. But as Clara drew closer, she could see signs of neglect that hadn't been visible from a distance. The porch needed repair. Weeds had overtaken the kitchen garden Thomas had mentioned with such pride, and the paint on the shutters was peeling. Whatever management Garrett Blackwood had been providing, it hadn't included maintaining the property with the care Thomas would have expected. A man emerged from the barn as Clara approached, and she recognized him immediately as the cold-eyed individual she had noticed outside Murphy's saloon. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years in the sun and wind. His clothes were expensive, too expensive for a ranch hand, and he wore them with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "You must be Mrs. Whitmore," he said, approaching the buggy with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Garrett Blackwood. I've been managing this place since Thomas passed." Clara remained seated in the buggy, using the height advantage to establish her authority from the beginning of their interaction. "Mr. Blackwood, I've come to inspect my property." "Of course," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Though I should mention that we're right in the middle of preparations for the auction. Wouldn't want anything to interfere with that process." "There won't be an auction," Clara said firmly. "This property belongs to me, and I have the documentation to prove it." Blackwood's expression hardened slightly, though he maintained his polite tone. "Well now, I heard there was some question about that. Judge Morrison mentioned there might be some complications with the inheritance." Clara climbed down from the buggy without waiting for assistance, a deliberate slight that Blackwood noticed. "The only complication is that certain people have been proceeding under false assumptions about my husband's estate." She walked toward the house, with Blackwood trailing behind her, his presence making the hair on the back of her neck prickle. The front door was unlocked, and Clara stepped inside to survey what had once been Thomas's home, and should have been hers. The interior of the house was well built and spacious, with a large front room that served as both parlour and dining area, and a kitchen that showed signs of Thomas's practical bachelor existence. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and Clara could imagine winter evenings, when Thomas would have sat before it, writing the letters that had been her only connection to this place. "Beautiful home," Blackwood commented, coming up behind her. "Thomas built it with an eye toward the future. Shame he didn't live to enjoy it properly." There was something in his tone that made Clara turn to face him directly. "You sound as though you knew him well." "We were neighbours, had plenty of occasion to discuss business matters." Blackwood moved closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. "Thomas was always talking about expanding his operation, maybe buying additional land. Problem was, he didn't always have the capital to back up his ambitions." "Is that so?" Clara kept her voice level, though every instinct was telling her to be careful around this man. "Oh yes, toward the end, he was making some questionable decisions, taking risks he couldn't afford." Blackwood's smile was predatory now. Gambling was just the beginning. There were other debts, other obligations. Clara recognized this as a continuation of Judge Morrison's strategy, building a false narrative about Thomas's financial irresponsibility to justify the theft of her inheritance. "I'd be interested to see documentation of these alleged debts. I'm sure that can be arranged," Blackwood replied. "Though you might find the truth more painful than you expect." The threat was barely veiled, and Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was alone on an isolated ranch, with a man who had clear motives for wanting her to disappear, just as Thomas had disappeared. "I'd like to look through the house," she said, moving toward the staircase that led to the second floor. "If you don't mind." "Not at all," Blackwood said, but he followed her closely as she climbed the stairs. The second floor contained 3 bedrooms and a small study that had clearly been Thomas's private domain. Clara's heart ached as she saw the desk where he had written his letters to her, the bookshelf filled with volumes on animal husbandry and land management, and the window that looked out over the ranch he had loved so much. But it was what she didn't see that told the real story. The desk drawers were empty. The file cabinet that Thomas had mentioned in his letters was gone entirely, and there were no personal papers of any kind visible in the room. "Where are my husband's records?" Clara asked, turning to face Blackwood. "Records?" Blackwood's expression was carefully neutral. "What sort of records?" "Business records, financial documents, correspondence, the papers any rancher would keep to manage his operation." "Oh, those! Judge Morrison had them collected after Thomas died. Legal requirement, you understand. Had to inventory the estate for probate purposes." Clara nodded as if this explanation satisfied her, though she was certain it was a lie. The systematic removal of Thomas's papers suggested a deliberate effort to eliminate evidence that might contradict the false narrative being constructed about his death. and debts. I see. And the contents of the house? Thomas's personal belongings? Stored safely away, Blackwood assured her. Everything's been catalogued and preserved for the estate proceedings. As they made their way back downstairs, Clara noticed details that supported her growing suspicions. The house showed signs of having been thoroughly searched. Books pulled slightly out of alignment on their shelves. Drawers that didn't quite close properly. Areas where furniture had been moved and not precisely repositioned. The ranch operation itself, Clara said as they stepped back onto the front porch. How many cattle? What's the current condition of the herd? Blackwood launched into a detailed description of the ranch's livestock and operations, clearly proud of his management skills, but Clara was only half listening. Her attention was focused on the landscape around the house, looking for anything that might provide clues about Thomas's death or the location of hidden documents. Mrs. Whitmore, Blackwood said suddenly, interrupting his own monologue. I hope you'll forgive my directness, but I think you should know that there are people in this town who aren't happy about your arrival. Clara felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression calm. Oh, your husband's debts affected a lot of folks. Money he owed, promises he couldn't keep. Some people were counting on the auction to settle those accounts. Blackwood stepped closer again, his voice dropping to a more threatening register. They might not take kindly to someone trying to interfere with that process. Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwood? Not threatening, warning. There's a difference. His smile was cold and reptilian. Copper Ridge can be a dangerous place for people who don't understand how things work. Accidents happen. The word accidents carried unmistakable implications, and Clara realized that Blackwood was telling her exactly what had happened to Thomas and what could happen to her if she continued to press her claim. I appreciate your concern, Clara said evenly, but I'm not easily frightened. Maybe you should be, Blackwood replied. Maybe Thomas would still be alive if he'd been a little more careful about who he crossed. The drive back to town gave Clara time to process what she had learned. The systematic removal of Thomas's papers, the obvious lies about his gambling debts, and Blackwood's barely concealed threats all painted a picture of a conspiracy that went far beyond simple greed. These people had murdered her husband and were now trying to steal his property, and they would kill her too if she stood in their way. But Clara had faced dangerous men before, and she had survived by being smarter, more prepared, and more ruthless than they expected. As she returned the horse and buggy to Tom Fletcher, she was already formulating her next moves. Everything go all right at the ranch? Tom asked, noting her serious expression. Quite educational, Clara replied. Tell me, Tom, would you happen to know where my husband kept his banking records, his account information? Tom glanced around nervously before answering. He banked with with Copper Ridge Trust. Judge Morrison's the president of the bank as well as the circuit judge. This revelation was like a puzzle piece clicking into place. Judge Morrison wasn't just corrupt, he was positioned to control every aspect of the conspiracy against her. As both judge and banker, he could manipulate legal proceedings and financial records with impunity. Tom, Clara said carefully, if someone wanted to send a telegram from Copper Ridge without everyone in town knowing about it, how would they go about that? Tom considered the question thoughtfully. Well, there's the railroad station about 20 miles east. They've got a telegraph office there, and the operator doesn't know folks from around here. Clara thanked him and walked back toward the inn, her mind racing with possibilities. She needed to contact Thomas's attorney in Denver and arrange for legal representation that couldn't be bought or intimidated by Judge Morrison. She also needed to send word to certain contacts she had made during her years of travel, people who specialized in dealing with situations exactly like this one. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Clara caught sight of Mrs. Hastings in the hallway, arranging fresh linens. The older woman looked up with obvious concern. Mrs. Whitmore, you look troubled. I hope your visit to the ranch went well. As well as could be expected, Clara replied. "Mrs. Hastings, may I ask you something in confidence?" Eleanor nodded, setting down her stack of linens. "Has anyone else in town ever questioned the circumstances of my husband's death?" Mrs. Hastings glanced around to ensure they were alone before answering. "There was talk at first. Thomas was known as a careful man, and that horse of his was gentle as a lamb. But when Judge Morrison ruled it an accident and Sheriff Reynolds closed the case," she shrugged helplessly, "people stopped asking questions." "People learned to stop asking questions," Mrs. Hastings corrected. "There's a difference." That evening, as Clara sat by her window planning her next moves, she noticed unusual activity in the street below. Several men had gathered near the saloon, their voices carrying on the night air. She couldn't make out their words, but their agitated gestures and frequent glances toward the inn suggested that her visit to the ranch had prompted some kind of emergency meeting. Clara checked the lock on her door and pulled the curtains closed. Tomorrow, she would ride to the railroad station and send her telegrams. She would also begin the process of building alliances with people in town who might be willing to stand up to Judge Morrison's corrupt regime. But tonight, she would keep watch and prepare for whatever desperate measures her enemies might attempt. The game was escalating, and Clara intended to be ready for the next move. The morning of the auction dawned clear and bright, with a crispness in the air that hinted at the approaching autumn. Clara had spent the previous 3 days in a flurry of activity, traveling to the railroad station to send telegrams, meeting quietly with potential allies in town, and preparing for what she knew would be the decisive confrontation of her fight for justice. Her telegrams to Denver had yielded immediate results. Thomas's attorney, Benjamin Hartwell, had confirmed not only the legitimacy of her marriage and inheritance, but had also provided devastating information about Judge Morrison's financial dealings. More importantly, Hartwell was en route to Copper Ridge with a federal marshal armed with warrants that would expose the corruption at the heart of the conspiracy against her. But Clara knew she couldn't wait for their arrival. The auction was scheduled for noon, and once the ranch was sold, untangling the legal mess would become infinitely more complicated. She had to act today, with the resources and allies she had already assembled. Her primary ally had proven to be an unexpected one. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, the town's physician, had approached Clara quietly 2 days earlier with information that changed everything. Dr. Sullivan had examined Thomas's body after his death and had found evidence that contradicted the official account of his accident. There were injuries that were inconsistent with a fall from a horse, Dr. Sullivan had told Clara during their clandestine meeting in the doctor's office after hours. Blunt force trauma to the back of his head and bruising on his arms that suggested he had been restrained. "I documented everything and sent my report to Judge Morrison, but it was never entered into the official record." Dr. Sullivan had kept copies of her medical findings hidden away in her personal files. More importantly, she had finally found someone with both the motivation and the resources to challenge Judge Morrison's authority. Clara's other allies included Tom Fletcher from the livery stable, several of the town's smaller merchants who had grown tired of Morrison's heavy-handed control of local business, and surprisingly, Sheriff Reynolds himself. The sheriff had approached Clara the previous evening with a mixture of shame and determination. "I've known for months that something wasn't right about Thomas's death," Reynolds had admitted, "but Morrison made it clear that asking too many questions would be bad for my health and my job. When you showed up with those documents, I realized I had a choice to make." Reynolds had agreed to help Clara expose the conspiracy, but only if she could guarantee protection from the federal authorities. Clara's telegram to Denver had arranged for exactly that protection. Now, as Clara prepared for the confrontation ahead, she dressed with particular care. She chose her red dress, the same one that had caused such a stir on her arrival, as a symbol of her defiance and determination. If Judge Morrison and his conspirators wanted to see her as a dangerous woman, she would give them exactly what they expected. The auction was to be held in the town square, with Judge Morrison presiding as both legal authority and auctioneer. As Clara made her way toward the crowd that had already gathered, she could feel the electricity of anticipation in the air. Word had spread that the mysterious widow was planning to disrupt the proceedings, and everyone in town had come to witness the spectacle. Judge Morrison stood on a makeshift platform, looking resplendent in his finest suit and projecting an air of absolute authority. Garrett Blackwood was positioned prominently near the front of the crowd, clearly confident that he would soon be the legal owner of the Whitmore Ranch. Several other men Clara didn't recognize were also present, presumably the out-of-town investors that Samuel Brooks had mentioned. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying easily across the square, "we are gathered here today for the legal disposition of the estate of Thomas Whitmore, deceased. This fine property, consisting of approximately 1,500 acres of prime grazing land, along with livestock, buildings and water rights, will be sold to the highest bidder." Clara stepped forward from the crowd, her red dress like a flame against the muted colors worn by the other townspeople. "Your Honor, I must object to these proceedings." A murmur ran through the crowd as Morrison's face darkened with annoyance. "Mrs. Whitmore, is it? We have already discussed your claims, and I have explained the legal complications that prevent your immediate inheritance of this property." "You have explained your fabricated complications," Clara replied, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the square. "But you have not explained why you ordered the systematic destruction of evidence that would contradict your false claims." This accusation caused a more dramatic stir among the spectators. Morrison's face flushed red, and his composure began to crack. "That is a serious accusation, madam, and one that I will not tolerate in my courtroom or in my town." "Then perhaps we should discuss it in a real courtroom," Clara suggested, "with real evidence and real witnesses." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a thick packet of documents. "I have here the medical examination report prepared by Dr. Sullivan immediately after my husband's death. It documents injuries that are completely inconsistent with a riding accident and strongly suggest that Thomas Whitmore was murdered." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers, and Dr. Sullivan stepped forward to support Clara's statement. "I examined the body personally," she announced. "Thomas Whitmore did not die in a riding accident. He was killed by blunt force trauma to the head after being physically restrained." Judge Morrison's face had gone pale, but he rallied quickly. Dr. Sullivan's opinions were considered and found to be inconclusive. The official cause of death remains accidental. "The official cause of death," Clara continued, "was determined by a corrupt judge who had financial incentives to see my husband dead and his property available for acquisition by his business partners." She pulled out another document. "This is a certified copy of the Articles of Incorporation for the Copper Ridge Development Company, filed in Denver 6 months before my husband's death. The principals of this company are Judge Morrison, Garrett Blackwood, and several investors who plan to acquire the Whitmore Ranch for a fraction of its value and develop it for mining operations." The revelation sent a shockwave through the crowd. Several people turned to stare at Morrison and Blackwood with new understanding, while others began talking excitedly among themselves. "Furthermore," Clara continued, "I have evidence that my husband discovered this conspiracy shortly before his death. He wrote to his attorney in Denver, expressing concerns about pressure to sell his land and suspicious activities in the area around his ranch." Garrett Blackwood pushed forward from the crowd, his face twisted with rage. "This is all lies and speculation. Thomas Whitmore was a drunk and a gambler who got himself killed through his own recklessness." "Really?" Clara turned to face him directly. "Then perhaps you can explain how a man who supposedly lost everything, gambling, managed to maintain detailed financial records showing a consistently profitable ranch operation right up until the day he died." She produced yet another document. "These are copies of my husband's bank records from Copper Ridge Trust, obtained through legal channels in Denver. They show no gambling debts, no unusual withdrawals, and a healthy balance that was mysteriously transferred to Judge Morrison's personal account 3 days after Thomas was declared dead. Judge Morrison stepped down from his platform, his facade of judicial authority finally crumbling. "That's enough! I will not stand here and listen to these wild accusations." "Then perhaps you'll prefer to discuss them with the federal authorities," Clara replied calmly. "I've taken the liberty of requesting an investigation into corruption in the territorial court system. A federal marshal should be arriving any moment to take you into custody." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses reached the crowd. Everyone turned to see a group of riders entering the town square, led by a man wearing the distinctive badge of a U.S. Marshal. Beside him rode Benjamin Hartwell, Thomas's attorney from Denver. The marshal dismounted and approached the platform, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "Judge Morrison, I'm Marshal James Crawford. I have warrants for your arrest on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder." The crowd erupted in chaos as Morrison tried to flee, and Blackwood made a desperate grab for the gun on his hip. But Sheriff Reynolds was ready for both moves. Having positioned himself strategically in the crowd, he tackled Blackwood before the man could draw his weapon, while several townspeople blocked Morrison's escape route. As the dust settled and the federal marshal took the conspirators into custody, Clara found herself surrounded by people who had spent weeks viewing her with suspicion and hostility. Now they looked at her with a mixture of admiration and awe. "Mrs. Whitmore," said Samuel Brooks from the general store, "I owe you an apology. We all do." Clara accepted his handshake graciously. "You couldn't have known the truth. These men were very skilled at hiding their crimes." Dr. Sullivan approached with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for giving me the courage to speak up. I've been carrying the guilt of Thomas's death for over a year." "You documented the truth," Clara replied. "That's what made justice possible." As the federal marshal led Judge Morrison and Garrett Blackwood away in shackles, Clara looked around the town square at the faces of people who were seeing their community in a new light. The corruption that had festered in Copper Ridge for years was finally being exposed, and the healing process could begin. Benjamin Hartwell approached with a smile and a thick folder of legal documents. "Mrs. Whitmore, I believe we can now proceed with the proper administration of your husband's estate. The ranch is yours, free and clear, along with all associated assets." Clara accepted the papers, but her attention was focused on the mountains in the distance, the same mountains that Thomas had described so lovingly in his letters. She was finally home, in the place they had planned to build their life together. "There's one more thing," she told the assembled crowd. "Thomas left specific bequests in his will for several people in town who had been kind to him. Tom Fletcher, he wanted you to have his horse Ranger. Dr. Sullivan, he left funds to establish a proper medical clinic. And Mrs. Hastings, he wanted to ensure that you would always have a place to stay if you ever needed it." The generosity of a dead man toward people who had shown him simple human kindness brought tears to many eyes in the crowd. Clara realized that this was Thomas's final gift to her, not just the ranch and the financial security it represented, but the foundation for building a real community in Copper Ridge. As the crowd began to disperse and the excitement of the day settled into a sense of new beginnings, Clara stood alone in the town square for a moment, feeling Thomas's presence as strongly as if he were standing beside her. She had kept her promise to him, reclaiming not just their property, but also his good name and the truth about his death. Tomorrow, she would ride out to the ranch and begin the work of rebuilding what had been damaged by corruption and neglect. But today, she had achieved something even more important. She had proven that justice was possible, even in a place where power had been used to crush the innocent. The woman they had called a gold digger had revealed herself to be something far more dangerous to corrupt men. A woman who could not be bought, intimidated, or silenced. And in doing so, she had not only reclaimed her inheritance, but had also freed an entire community from the grip of those who had abused their trust. 3 weeks after the dramatic events in the town square, Clara stood on the front porch of the Whitmore Ranch, watching the sun rise over land that now belonged to her without question or legal challenge. The federal investigation had moved swiftly, with Judge Morrison and Garrett Blackwood both facing serious charges that would likely result in lengthy prison sentences. The web of corruption they had built was being systematically dismantled, and Copper Ridge was slowly healing from the wounds of their abuse. Clara had thrown herself into the work of restoring the ranch with an energy that surprised even her. Years of traveling and surviving on her own had made her more practical and self-sufficient than most women of her social class, and she discovered that she genuinely enjoyed the physical challenges of ranch management. With the help of several hired hands recommended by Tom Fletcher, she had begun the process of repairing buildings, improving the livestock operation, and implementing the expansion plans that Thomas had outlined in his letters. The morning routine had become a source of deep satisfaction for Clara. She rose before dawn, checked on the animals, reviewed the accounts, and planned the day's work with the hands. It was a far cry from the genteel life she had known in Denver and San Francisco, but it felt more authentic and meaningful than anything she had experienced before. "Mrs. Whitmore?" called a voice from the yard. Clara looked up to see Tom Fletcher approaching on horseback, leading a second mount behind him. "Thought you might like to ride the property line today. There's something I think you should see." Clara had come to rely heavily on Tom's knowledge and judgment. After the events at the auction, she had offered him a permanent position as ranch foreman, and he had accepted with enthusiasm. His honesty and loyalty were exactly what she needed as she worked to build a new life in Copper Ridge. They rode north through rolling hills covered with tall grass that waved in the morning breeze. The cattle looked healthy and well-fed, and Clara felt a surge of pride as she surveyed the thriving operation that was now her responsibility. Thomas had chosen this land well, and his vision for its potential was becoming reality under her stewardship. "There," Tom said, pointing toward a distant hillside. "You see that ridge line? That's where we found evidence of the survey markers Morrison and Blackwood had placed without permission." Clara studied the terrain with interest. The federal investigation had revealed that the conspiracy against her had been even more extensive than she had initially realized. Morrison and Blackwood hadn't just planned to steal the ranch through fraudulent legal proceedings. They had also been secretly surveying the property for mineral deposits, particularly the silver ore that geological surveys suggested might exist in the surrounding mountains. "Have we heard anything more from the mining engineers?" Clara asked. "Yes, ma'am. The report came back yesterday. There's definitely silver in those hills, probably enough to justify a major mining operation." Tom's expression was serious. "That's why they were so determined to get this land. They weren't just stealing a ranch. They were stealing what could have been a fortune in mining rights." Clara nodded thoughtfully. The discovery of valuable mineral deposits on her land presented both opportunities and challenges. Mining could provide significant additional income, but it would also change the character of the ranch and the surrounding community. She would need to consider carefully how to balance the potential benefits against the environmental and social costs. As they rode back toward the house, Clara noticed a rider approaching from the direction of town. The figure resolved itself into Dr. Margaret Sullivan, who had become one of Clara's closest friends and advisors in the weeks since the confrontation with Morrison. "Clara," Dr. Sullivan called as she drew near. "I have news from town. Good news, I think." They dismounted near the corral, and Clara invited Dr. Sullivan into the house for coffee. The interior of the ranch house had been transformed since Clara's first visit. She had brought many of Thomas's personal belongings out of storage and had added her own touches to create a home that honored his memory while reflecting her own personality. "What's the news?" Clara asked, as she poured coffee from the pot that seemed to be perpetually brewing on the kitchen stove. The territorial governor has announced that he's appointing a new circuit judge for our district, Dr. Sullivan said, with obvious satisfaction. Someone with an actual legal education and no ties to local business interests. This was indeed excellent news. The corruption of Judge Morrison had left the entire region without proper legal authority, creating complications for everything from land disputes to criminal proceedings. A legitimate judge would be essential for the long-term stability of the community. There's more, Dr. Sullivan continued. The governor is also funding the establishment of a proper sheriff's department with trained deputies and resources to actually enforce the law. Sheriff Reynolds will be retained, but with better support and oversight. Clara smiled at this development. Reynolds had proven himself during the crisis, but he had been operating with minimal resources and no backup. Professional law enforcement would help ensure that the kind of corruption that had flourished under Morrison couldn't take root again. And the best news of all, Dr. Sullivan said, her eyes sparkling with excitement, is that the territorial legislature has approved funding for a proper medical clinic in Copper Ridge. I'll finally be able to provide the kind of care this community deserves. Clara clasped her friend's hand warmly. Margaret, that's wonderful. Thomas would be so pleased to know that his bequest helped make this possible. The three of them, Clara, Dr. Sullivan and Tom, spent the morning discussing the changes that were sweeping through Copper Ridge. The removal of Morrison's corrupt influence had unleashed a wave of civic improvement and community spirit that was transforming the town. New businesses were opening, families were moving to the area, and there was a sense of optimism that had been missing during the years of Morrison's dominance. You know, Dr. Sullivan said thoughtfully, you've become something of a hero in town. People are calling you the woman who saved Copper Ridge. Clara felt uncomfortable with such praise. I simply refused to let them steal what belonged to me. Any woman in my position would have done the same. No, Tom interjected. They wouldn't have. Most people would have been intimidated into accepting whatever settlement Morrison offered. You had the courage to fight back and the intelligence to do it effectively. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another visitor, Benjamin Hartwell, Thomas's attorney from Denver. Clara was surprised to see him, as they had concluded their legal business the previous week. Mr. Hartwell, she said, rising to greet him, I wasn't expecting you. I apologize for arriving unannounced, Hartwell replied, but I have some information that I thought you should hear immediately. They gathered in the front parlor, and Hartwell opened his briefcase to withdraw a thick folder of documents. The federal investigation into Morrison's activities has uncovered something extraordinary, he began. It appears that Thomas wasn't the only property owner who was targeted by their conspiracy. They had identified at least 6 other ranches and mining claims that they planned to acquire through similar fraudulent means. Clara felt a chill as she considered the implications. How many other people might have been murdered? We may never know for certain, Hartwell admitted. But there were at least 3 other suspicious deaths in the past 2 years, all involving property owners who had refused to sell to Morrison's development company. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Morrison and his associates hadn't just been corrupt officials taking advantage of their positions. They had been operating what amounted to a criminal enterprise that used murder and legal fraud to steal valuable property from legitimate owners. What happens now? Dr. Sullivan asked. The federal authorities are expanding their investigation, Hartwell explained. They're also reviewing every legal proceeding that Morrison handled during his tenure as judge. It's going to take months, possibly years, to undo all the damage he caused. Clara absorbed this information with mixed emotions. She was grateful that justice was being served and that other victims of Morrison's crimes might receive restitution. But she was also deeply saddened by the realization that Thomas's death had been part of a much larger pattern of violence and corruption. "There's one more thing," Hartwell continued. "The territorial government has asked if you would be willing to serve on a commission that's being established to recommend reforms to prevent this kind of corruption in the future." Clara was startled by the request. "Me? I'm hardly qualified for such a responsibility." "On the contrary," Hartwell replied, "you're uniquely qualified. You understand both the legal vulnerabilities that allowed Morrison to operate and the practical challenges of fighting corruption in isolated communities. Your insights could help protect other people from experiencing what you and Thomas went through." The idea of leaving the ranch, even temporarily, to work on territorial reforms didn't immediately appeal to Clara. She had found peace and purpose in the life she was building here, and she was reluctant to return to the world of politics and legal maneuvering. But as she considered the matter more carefully, she realized that accepting the appointment would be a way of ensuring that Thomas's death had not been in vain. If her experience could help prevent other families from suffering similar losses, then she had a moral obligation to share what she had learned. "I'll consider it," she told Hartwell, "but I want to make sure the ranch is stable first. And any work I do for the territorial government would have to be arranged so that I can continue to live here." "I'm sure that can be accommodated," Hartwell assured her. After Hartwell departed, Clara spent the afternoon walking the property with Tom and Dr. Sullivan, discussing the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The ranch was prospering under her management. The community was healing from the trauma of Morrison's corruption, and there were possibilities for service and leadership that she had never imagined. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Clara stood once again on her front porch and reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been a widow traveling to an unknown frontier town to claim an inheritance. Now she was an established member of a community that looked to her for leadership and guidance. The transformation had been as dramatic as it was unexpected. Clara had discovered strengths and capabilities she hadn't known she possessed, and she had found a purpose that gave meaning to the grief and loss she had endured. But most importantly, she had honored Thomas's memory by refusing to let his killers profit from their crimes. The ranch he had built was not just surviving, it was thriving, and it would continue to thrive for generations to come. As the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Clara felt a sense of peace and completion that had eluded her for many years. She was home at last, in the place where she and Thomas had always intended to build their life together. And while their dreams had been interrupted by violence and greed, they would ultimately be fulfilled by her determination to see justice done and truth revealed. The woman they had called a gold digger had proven to be something far more valuable, a force for justice and positive change in a community that desperately needed both. 1 year after the dramatic events that had transformed Copper Ridge, Clara stood in the same town square where she had confronted Judge Morrison and exposed the conspiracy that had murdered her husband. But now, instead of facing a hostile crowd intent on stealing her inheritance, she was surrounded by friends and neighbors who had gathered to celebrate the first annual Founders' Day festival, a new tradition that honored the legitimate builders and pioneers of the community. The changes in both Clara and the town were remarkable. Copper Ridge had grown from a dusty frontier settlement plagued by corruption into a thriving community that attracted honest settlers and legitimate businesses. The population had nearly doubled, a new school had been built, and Dr. Sullivan's medical clinic had become a model for frontier healthcare that was drawing attention from across the territory. Clara herself had evolved from a woman fighting for survival into a recognized leader whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of her ranch. She had accepted the territorial appointment that Benjamin Hartwell had offered, serving on the commission that was rewriting laws to prevent the kind of judicial corruption that had flourished under Morrison. Her recommendations had been adopted not just in Montana Territory, but in several other frontier regions facing similar challenges. "Mrs. Whitmore," called a familiar voice from the crowd. Clara turned to see Tom Fletcher approaching, now wearing the badge of assistant sheriff and accompanied by a pretty young woman in a blue dress. "I'd like you to meet my fiancée, Miss Sarah Coleman. She arrived on last week's stage from Kansas." Clara smiled warmly as she shook hands with the young woman. Tom had proven to be not just an excellent ranch foreman, but also a natural leader in the community. His engagement to Miss Coleman was just one of many signs that Copper Ridge was becoming the kind of place where people wanted to build permanent lives. "Miss Coleman, welcome to Copper Ridge. I hope you'll find our community welcoming." "Oh yes, ma'am," Sarah replied enthusiastically. "Tom has told me so much about the changes here, and about everything you've done for the town." Clara deflected the praise gracefully, as she had learned to do over the past year. While she appreciated the recognition, she was uncomfortable with the hero worship that sometimes accompanied it. Her fight for justice had been deeply personal, motivated by love for Thomas and determination to honor his memory, rather than any abstract desire to reform society. "Mrs. Whitmore," another voice called from across the square. This time it was Dr. Margaret Sullivan, hurrying toward them with obvious excitement. "I have news. The territorial governor has just announced that Copper Ridge is being designated as the county seat for the new Whitmore County." The crowd around them erupted in cheers at this announcement. County seat designation meant government offices, increased commerce, and the kind of official recognition that would ensure Copper Ridge's continued growth and prosperity. "Whitmore County?" Clara asked with surprise. "Named in honor of Thomas and his contributions to the development of the territory," Dr. Sullivan explained. "It was the governor's idea. He said that Thomas's sacrifice had led to reforms that benefited the entire region." Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes. The thought that Thomas would be remembered not as a victim of violence, but as someone whose death had led to positive change, was deeply moving. It transformed his murder from a senseless tragedy into something that had ultimate meaning and purpose. As the festivities continued around them, Clara found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in a red dress, judged and dismissed by people who knew nothing about her, had proven to be exactly what Copper Ridge needed, someone with the courage to challenge corruption and the determination to see justice done. But the transformation hadn't been without its costs. The fight against Morrison and his associates had taken a toll on Clara that went beyond the obvious physical dangers. She had been forced to become harder and more calculating than she had ever wanted to be, and she sometimes wondered if the gentler person she had been before Thomas's death was lost forever. "You look thoughtful," observed a voice beside her. Clara turned to see Eleanor Hastings, the inn proprietor who had become one of her closest friends and advisors. "Just reflecting on how much has changed," Clara replied. "Sometimes I hardly recognize the person I was when I first arrived here." Eleanor smiled knowingly. "Growth and change are natural, Clara. You've become who you needed to become, to honor your husband's memory and protect your community. That's nothing to regret. I know, it's just, sometimes I wonder what Thomas would think of the woman I've become, whether he would recognize me." "He would be proud," Eleanor said firmly. "Any man would be proud to have a wife who fought so hard for justice and truth." As if summoned by their conversation about the past, Clara noticed a familiar figure making his way through the crowd toward them. It was Benjamin Hartwell, now a regular visitor to Copper Ridge in his capacity as Clara's legal advisor and friend. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said formally, though his smile was warm, "I have some final news to share about the Morrison investigation." Clara braced herself, uncertain whether she wanted to hear more details about the conspiracy that had cost Thomas his life. "Garrett Blackwood has agreed to a plea bargain," Hartwell continued. In exchange for his cooperation in testifying against the other conspirators, he'll serve 15 years in territorial prison. Judge Morrison will serve 25 years, and several of the other participants have received shorter sentences. Clara felt a sense of closure at this news. While no amount of punishment could bring Thomas back, the knowledge that his killers would spend the rest of their lives in prison provided a form of justice that she could accept. "There's more," Hartwell added. "The territorial government has recovered most of the money that Morrison stole from various victims over the years. Your share alone amounts to nearly $50,000, money that Morrison embezzled from the ranch account after Thomas's death. The sum was staggering, more than enough to expand the ranch operation significantly or to invest in other business ventures. But Clara found that the money mattered less to her than the principle it represented. Every dollar recovered was proof that crime didn't pay and that justice could prevail even in the most challenging circumstances. "What will you do with it?" Dr. Sullivan asked. Clara had been considering this question for weeks, ever since Hartwell had first told her about the recovered funds. "I want to establish a foundation in Thomas's name," she said finally. "Something to help other widows and families who find themselves facing legal challenges they can't afford to fight." The idea had come to her gradually, as she reflected on her own advantages in the battle against Morrison. She had been fortunate to have some financial resources, education, and contacts that many frontier women lacked. Without those advantages, she might never have been able to prove her case or protect her inheritance. "That's a wonderful idea," Eleanor said approvingly. "There are too many people in situations like yours who don't have the means to fight back." As the sun began to set over the town square and the Founders' Day celebration moved into its evening phase, Clara found herself standing once again at the spot where she had confronted Judge Morrison a year earlier. The memory of that day was still vivid. The fear, the anger, the determination to see justice done, regardless of the personal cost. But now, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had come to respect and value her contributions to their community, Clara felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for most of the past year. She had not only reclaimed her inheritance and brought her husband's killers to justice, she had also built something positive and lasting from the ashes of tragedy. "Mrs. Whitmore," a young boy approached hesitantly, clutching a piece of paper in his small hands. "My teacher said I should give this to you." Clara accepted the paper and unfolded it to reveal a child's drawing of a woman in a red dress, standing triumphantly over a group of defeated villains. At the bottom, in careful script, were the words, "Thank you for saving our town." The innocence and sincerity of the gesture nearly overwhelmed Clara. This child, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, understood something that many adults missed, that the fight against corruption wasn't just about legal proceedings and financial settlements, but about creating a community where children could grow up safely and honestly. "What's your name?" Clara asked gently. "Jimmy Morrison," the boy replied, then quickly added, "But I'm not related to the bad judge. My family came here after he was arrested." Clara smiled at his earnest clarification. Even the name Morrison was being reclaimed by honest people who wanted to make positive contributions to the community. "Thank you for the drawing, Jimmy. I'll treasure it." As the evening grew later and the crowd began to disperse, Clara made her way back to her horse for the ride home to the ranch. The familiar journey through the darkening landscape had become one of her favorite parts of each day, a time for reflection and planning that connected her to the land that Thomas had loved so much. The ranch house appeared in the distance, its windows glowing warmly with lamplight. Clara had hired a housekeeper, Mrs. Patricia Wells, a widow from Denver who had brought both domestic expertise and companionship to the isolated property. The house was no longer the lonely bachelor dwelling that Thomas had maintained, but a true home that welcomed visitors and celebrated the bonds of friendship and community. As Clara settled her horse in the stable and walked toward the house, She reflected on the question that Eleanor Hastings had posed earlier. What would Thomas think of the woman she had become? Clara thought she knew the answer now. Thomas would recognize her completely, because she had become exactly the woman he had always believed her to be. Strong enough to fight for what was right, intelligent enough to outmaneuver her enemies, and compassionate enough to use her victory to help others facing similar challenges. The qualities that had enabled her to survive and triumph hadn't been created by adversity. They had simply been revealed and strengthened by it. Inside the house, Mrs. Wells had prepared a simple dinner and was waiting to hear about the day's festivities. As Clara recounted the events of the Founders' Day celebration, she realized that this, sitting in her own home, sharing the day's experiences with a friend, planning for tomorrow's work, was exactly the life that she and Thomas had dreamed of building together. The dream had been interrupted by violence and greed, but it had not been destroyed. Clara had honored Thomas's memory, not just by bringing his killers to justice, but by creating the kind of life and community that he would have been proud to be part of. As she prepared for bed that night, Clara looked out her bedroom window at the vast Montana sky, brilliant with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Somewhere among those stars, she liked to imagine, Thomas was watching over the ranch and the town that bore his name, satisfied that his legacy was in capable hands. The woman they had called a gold digger had proven to be something infinitely more valuable, a force for justice, a builder of communities, and a guardian of the truth. And in the years to come, as Whitmore County grew and prospered, people would remember not just the corruption that had been defeated, but the courage and determination that had made victory possible. Clara Whitmore had come to Copper Ridge to claim an inheritance. Instead, she had claimed something far more precious, a place in history as the woman who had refused to let evil triumph, and who had built something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of tragedy. The real treasure had never been gold or land or money. It had been the strength to stand up for what was right, regardless of the cost. And that treasure would endure long after all the other riches had turned to dust.